The moment David placed the tiny GPS tracker in Sarah's purse, something inside him died. After 15 years of marriage, had it really come to this? If you've ever felt that gut-wrenching suspicion that the person you love most might be living a double life, stay with me, because what David discovers next, and especially what he decides to do about it, might just change how you think about love, betrayal, and the human capacity for forgiveness. Like and subscribe if you've ever wondered what you'd do if your entire world shattered in an instant. David stared at the blinking dot on his phone screen, watching it move across town to an address he didn't recognize. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel of his parked car. 3 months of late-night, work emergencies, mysterious text messages, and the growing distance between them had led to this moment. Sarah, his college sweetheart and wife of 15 years, had been acting differently. The subtle changes were almost imperceptible at first: a new perfume, guarded conversations, her phone always face down. But David knew her better than anyone. Something wasn't right. Their story had begun so differently. They met during sophomore year when Sarah spilled coffee all over his economics textbook. He'd been annoyed until he looked up and saw her horrified expression, those striking green eyes wide with embarrassment. Instead of getting angry, he'd laughed, and she'd laughed too, relieved. That moment had sparked something neither of them expected, a connection that felt unbreakable. They'd been inseparable ever since, supporting each other through graduate school, building careers, buying their first home, and trying for years to start a family. The infertility had been hard on both of them, but especially Sarah. 3 miscarriages in 5 years had left invisible scars. David thought they were healing together, but lately, he wondered if they'd been drifting apart instead. The counseling sessions had stopped 6 months ago when Sarah claimed they were doing better. Now he questioned everything. David started his car and followed the GPS signal, his heart pounding against his ribs. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, maybe Sarah meeting a colleague for an innocent lunch? But why would she lie about where she was going? She'd told him she was shopping with her sister today. The dot stopped moving at a small hotel on the outskirts of town. David parked across the street, feeling sick. 20 minutes later, Sarah emerged from the lobby, but she wasn't alone. A tall man with his arm around her waist walked her to a black sedan. Before she got in, the man pulled her close and kissed her, not a friendly peck, but the kind of kiss that left no room for misinterpretation. David couldn't breathe. The world tilted sideways as 15 years of trust collapsed in an instant. He wanted to rush across the street, confront them both, demand answers. Instead, he sat frozen, watching as the car drove away, taking his wife and the stranger with it. For a week, David said nothing. He went through the motions of their shared life like a ghost, eating dinner across from her, sleeping beside her, all while carrying the crushing weight of what he'd seen. He checked the tracker obsessively, confirming 3 more meetings with the same man. Each discovery was like a knife twisting deeper. On Friday evening, Sarah announced she was meeting her book club. The GPS showed her returning to the same hotel. David poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and waited in the dark living room for her return. When she walked through the door at 11:30 p.m., her cheeks flushed and hair slightly disheveled, he simply asked, "How was book club?" "Good," she said, avoiding his eyes. "We discussed that new thriller everyone's talking about." "What was it called?" he asked quietly. Sarah hesitated. "You wouldn't know it." "Try me." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Finally, David spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was no book club tonight, was there, Sarah?" Her face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" David placed his phone on the coffee table, the GPS app open, the blinking dot clearly visible at the hotel's address. "I know where you were. I know who you were with." Sarah's purse slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a thud. "You've been tracking me?" Her voice rose with indignation, but David could see the panic behind her eyes. "Don't," he said. Don't try to make this about me. 3 months, Sarah. How long have you been seeing him? The facade crumbled. Sarah sank onto the couch, her shoulders hunched. 6 months, she whispered. 6 months. Half a year of lies. David felt something break inside him. His name is Michael, she continued, words tumbling out now. He's a grief counselor. I met him after the last miscarriage. I was so lost, David. You were trying to be strong for both of us, but I needed something else, someone who understood that kind of pain. So you slept with him? David's voice cracked. It wasn't about sex at first. He listened. He made me feel like I wasn't broken. Sarah looked up, tears streaming down her face. But then it changed. I didn't mean for it to happen. They never do, David said bitterly. I love you, David. I've always loved you. Don't. He stood up, unable to bear her proximity. Don't say that to me right now. That night, David slept in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as his mind replayed every moment of their marriage, searching for signs he might have missed. By morning, he'd made a decision. He packed a bag and booked a hotel room for himself. Before leaving, he left Sarah a note, I need time. Don't contact me for 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the darkest of David's life. He barely ate, barely slept. He called in sick to work and spent days walking aimlessly through the city, trying to outpace his thoughts. He ignored Sarah's increasingly desperate texts and calls. Friends reached out, concerned, but he couldn't bring himself to explain what had happened. On the 10th day, David found himself sitting across from a divorce attorney, listening to cold explanations of asset division and alimony. The words washed over him without sinking in. As he left the office, paperwork in hand, he passed a small bookstore. In the window display was a book titled, Healing After Betrayal. Something compelled him to go inside. The elderly shopkeeper noticed his interest. That's a good one, she said. Helped me when my Harold had his midlife crisis with his secretary 30 years ago. David looked at her in surprise. You stayed with him? She nodded. Hardest thing I ever did. Also the best decision I ever made. She studied his face. Everyone told me to leave, said I deserved better. Maybe I did. But what I discovered was that people are complicated, marriages even more so. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't the perfect ones, but the ones that survive the impossible. David bought the book. That night, he read it cover to cover, underlining passages that resonated with his pain. One line in particular stood out, forgiveness is not about excusing the behavior, it's about choosing to release yourself from the prison of bitterness. The next morning, David did something unexpected. He called Michael. I know who you are, David said when the man answered. I know about you and my wife. There was a long pause. I understand if you want to meet, Michael finally said, his voice steady. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown. David arrived early, his stomach in knots. When Michael walked in, tall, distinguished, exactly as David had seen from across the street, he felt a surge of hatred so intense it frightened him. Michael sat down without ordering. I won't insult you with apologies, he said. Good, David replied. I didn't come for apologies. I came to understand. For the next hour, Michael spoke candidly about how he'd met Sarah, how their professional relationship had crossed boundaries it never should have. She loves you, Michael said. Even when we were together, she talked about you. About your kindness, your strength. She's lost, David. The miscarriages broke something in her that she doesn't know how to fix. And you took advantage of that, David said, his voice hard. Michael didn't flinch. Yes. I did. I broke every professional and ethical code I claim to uphold. I have no excuse. Are you in love with her? Michael considered the question. I care for Sarah deeply. But what we have isn't love, it's mutual pain seeking comfort in the wrong places. We both know that. David stood to leave, having heard enough. But Michael's next words stopped him. She ended it, you know. The day after you confronted her. She said she couldn't lose you, that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. David walked out without responding. He drove to the cemetery where they had buried their hopes 3 times over, tiny graves with only dates, no names. They had never been able to decide on names. Standing there, David finally allowed himself to weep, for the children they'd lost, for the pain that had driven them apart, for the uncertain future ahead. When the 2 weeks were up, David returned home. Sarah was sitting on the front porch, waiting. She looked smaller somehow, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. Neither spoke as he sat beside her. Finally, David broke the silence. I met with Michael. Sarah's head snapped up. You what? I needed to understand. And do you? Understand? David sighed. No. Not entirely. But I'm trying. I ended it, she said quickly. The day after you found out. I swear, David, it's over. I know. He looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. I don't know if we can fix this, Sarah. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. But I do know that walking away without trying would haunt me forever. Sarah reached for his hand tentatively. When he didn't pull away, she gripped it tightly. I'll do anything, she whispered. Whatever it takes. It won't be easy, David warned. There will be days I can't look at you without seeing you with him. Days I'll want to hurt you the way you've hurt me. I know, she said. I deserve that. No, David shook his head. That's not what I want for us. I don't want a marriage built on punishment and resentment. If we do this, if we try to rebuild, it has to be about healing, not hurting. That conversation marked the beginning of the hardest year of their lives. They found a new therapist, one who specialized in infidelity and grief. They set boundaries, created new rituals, learned to communicate in ways they never had before. There were setbacks, nights when David couldn't bear to be in the same room as Sarah, days when Sarah's shame was so overwhelming she could barely function. 6 months in, they faced another crisis when Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. The joy was immediately overshadowed by fear of another loss, but also David's unspoken question, whose child was it? A paternity test early in the pregnancy confirmed the baby was David's. The relief was palpable, but it also forced them to confront the reality that this child, if carried to term, would be born into a family still healing from deep wounds. As Sarah's pregnancy progressed without complications, something shifted between them. The shared anxiety over each doctor's appointment, the collective holding of breath until they passed the point of previous losses, it united them in a way nothing else could have. They began to hope again, cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. Emma Rose was born on a snowy December morning, healthy and perfect. As David held his daughter for the first time, looking into eyes that mirrored his own, he felt the last pieces of his anger begin to dissolve. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but transformed into something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. On their 16th wedding anniversary, with 7-month-old Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib, David and Sarah sat in their backyard under the stars. Sarah handed him a small package. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it," she urged. Inside was a journal, its leather cover engraved with their initials. David opened it to find Sarah's handwriting filling the first several pages. "It's every reason I love you," she explained. "One for each day since Emma was born. I want to fill it completely, to give you tangible proof of what you mean to me. Not just words, but actions. Every day." David traced the words with his fingers, feeling the indentations her pen had made on the paper. "I have something for you too," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a new wedding band, different from the one he'd given her 17 years ago. "I thought we could renew our vows," he said. "Not to erase what happened, but to acknowledge that we're different people now. That we've chosen each other again, with our eyes wide open." Sarah slipped the ring onto her finger, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. 2 years after David discovered Sarah's affair, they stood in their backyard surrounded by close friends and family. Emma toddled between them, oblivious to the significance of the day but delighting in the attention. As they recited vows they had written together, David looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw not just the woman who had betrayed him, but the woman who had fought alongside him to save what they had built. "Love isn't perfect," David said in his vows. "It's messy and complicated and sometimes it breaks. But what I've learned is that broken doesn't mean beyond repair. Sometimes the breaks become the strongest parts, if we're brave enough to do the work of healing." Sarah squeezed his hands, her voice steady as she responded. "I promise to be worthy of the second chance we've given each other. To remember that trust is rebuilt one day at a time. To never take for granted the gift of your forgiveness." As they sealed their renewed commitment with a kiss, David felt something he hadn't expected to feel again: peace. Not the naive peace of their first wedding day, but something deeper and more resilient. A peace that acknowledged the storms they had weathered and might still face, but trusted in their ability to stand together against whatever came next. Their story didn't end with happily ever after. Real life rarely does. There were still difficult days, triggers that brought back painful memories, moments of doubt. But there was also joy, in watching Emma grow, in the small daily acts of love they consciously performed for each other, in the knowledge that they had faced the worst and chosen to rebuild rather than retreat. 5 years after the affair, Sarah received a job offer in another state. It would mean uprooting their lives, starting fresh in a new community. They discussed it for weeks, weighing pros and cons. Finally, David made a suggestion that surprised them both. "Let's do it," he said. "Let's go somewhere new, somewhere without ghosts." The move marked another turning point. In their new home, they were simply David and Sarah, parents to Emma and her new baby brother, Thomas. Their history traveled with them, of course, but it no longer defined them. On the 10th anniversary of what they now called the breaking point, David and Sarah returned to their old city for a weekend alone. They visited the cemetery where their unborn children rested. They drove past their first house. And, at David's suggestion, they went to the hotel where he had first discovered Sarah's betrayal. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with anxiety as they pulled into the parking lot. David nodded. "I need to reclaim this place. To see it without the lens of that day." They checked into a room, not the same one, but similar. As they stood awkwardly in the impersonal space, Sarah began to cry. "I'm so sorry," she said, words she had spoken countless times over the years. "I wish I could erase what I did to you." David took her face in his hands. "I don't," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "What happened between us was terrible. It caused pain I wouldn't wish on anyone. But look at us now, Sarah. Look at what we built from the ashes. Would we have the marriage we have today without going through that fire? Would we appreciate each other the way we do?" That night, they made love with a tenderness that acknowledged both their scars and their healing. Afterward, as Sarah slept beside him, David reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The man he had been a decade ago could never have imagined this outcome, that betrayal could lead to deeper connection, that the greatest test of their love would ultimately strengthen it. The next morning, as they checked out of the hotel, the clerk commented on what a lovely couple they were. "Anniversary?" she asked with a smile. David and Sarah exchanged a look filled with private understanding. "Something like that," David replied. "We're celebrating a second chance."